Greetings to another fireside service of reflection and prayer. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, our topic is hell. Often a very tough topic, one that many of us justifiably, I believe, gravitate to when we reject a lot of dogma and religious upbringing even. But before we get into that, I want to greet all the folks in our chatzy. It's great to see you all here. And it looks like we are joined by the Reverend Jane Siebert in our chatzy. So as you probably know, she was our last guest. So it's wonderful to see you there. Mark, it's been great chatting with you as we started, and Albert, Bill, Ward, Alyssa, all of you are so wonderful, and we're happy to be joined by each other, hopefully, in this service. So, what do we mean when we say hell? Are we talking about an afterlife where everyone who's a non-believer is punished? Are we talking about a more worldly thing, perhaps? This could be hell on earth. There's a lot of different ideas about hell, but usually it's a metaphysical thing, right? It's a afterlife where anyone who doesn't fit whatever the particulars are is cast into and essentially tortured for their entire life, as many of the descriptions go. Well, today in this service, as we get started, I want to just say that we're here to kind of break a lot of those assumptions and look at perhaps a more, dare I say it, digestible hell, maybe a redefinition of hell, at least in Swedenborg's metaphysical terms, Emanuel Swedenborg, and maybe even an opening of heaven. So let us start in our traditional way by opening our scripture, representing many different things, but also how divinity speaks to us through the deeper inner metaphor of scripture, biblical and otherwise, of the scripture written on our hearts, in our lives and experiences, and how God hopes to use that deep metaphor and conversation to transform our spirit to better loving and less hellishness. Let us also light our candle, cyber or otherwise, representing how divinity lightens our lives. You know the song, This Little Light of Mine, it's one of my favorites. Lightens our spirits, our wisdom with illumination in a very real sense. This evening we are talking about hell and whether or not hell is real. What is hell? So this is kind of a deep, maybe heavy subject, but when we talk about hell, often we think of this very torturous environment where people are cast there if they do not fit a specific set of ideas, usually a specific dogma, creed, religion. We also talk about hell in layman's terms or colloquially when we mention something being quite harmful, destructive, scary, etc. We talk about hellish attitudes and hellish states of, let's say, political discourse or something else. In a way, Emanuel Swedenborg, the mystical theologian who helped inspire this tradition, talks about both of those things in his visions and understandings of hell. That they're actually very much related, more so than if we define hell just to be a dogmatic place where you get tortured forever. In fact, that's not Swedenborg's hell, and it's not a hell that I would ever believe. maybe it's not one that you would either. And yet often that is the hell that we hear. So for a little background, Emanuel Swedenborg, a Christian mystic, but very interfaith in his theology and visions of heaven, he actually said that heaven is more interfaith than we could imagine, that the diversity of the spiritual realm that is heaven actually lends to the perfection that is heaven, because all the beings of heaven receive their goodness, their wisdom from the infinity of divinity, and they embody it and live it forward. And that makes heaven the more heaven is populated. So there's no overpopulation issues in heaven. It's actually looking to increase as much as it can. On the other hand, Swedenborg did believe in a hell, despite the seeming, perhaps, universalism of that definition of heaven. So, there are universalists in the world. You may be one yourself. Someone who believes that there is no hell. That this idea of hell is totally ridiculous. And, how do we even know that there's an afterlife, let alone a hell? Like, if we're going to go to hell in terms of our language, what we share immediately, then it's probably just to hurt people, maybe to scare people. It seems kind of made up. Well, in Swedenborg's hell, even though he sounds almost universal, there are people there. There are people who choose to stay in this hellish realm forever. And yes, it is a choice from Swedenborg's point of view. Hell to him has to do with our internal orientation towards destructive, selfish things. Hell, much like heaven, is characterized by its spiritual attributes, by the internal state of those in the next life. In fact, bodies and environments in the next life represent that internal state. And so heaven, being as beautiful and magnificent beyond comprehension, almost, according to Swedenborg, as it is, and multi-layered, different societies even, that has to do with the expression of the people there, their inward lives, and their reception and living of divinity. Hell, on the other hand, is somewhat a scary place in Swedenborg's visions. And yet the people there don't mind. They actually see that hellish landscape, see their bodies as exactly what they should be, in line. And often these people are caught up in fantasy, are caught up in their destructive habits, but they're not always allowed to just hurt each other. So not only does hell exist for Swedenborg, but it's a place with some type of governance and some limitation to, you could say, the torture of it. And that governance comes from God. According to Swedenborg, the Lord governs the hells. And I'm not just talking about the Dark Lord, although Christ may be dark in appearance sometimes, who knows. Now, that begs the question, well, why would anyone want to stay there if it's torturous? Well, in Swedenborg's idea of the torture of hell, that torture is just being hellish. It's kind of the relative difference between a hellish life and a heavenly one in this world. In fact, that is the key difference for Swedenborg, just how we want to live our life in this world and the next. In fact, we are in connection with the spiritual plane, heaven and hell, even in this very moment. So in a way, heaven and hell are spaces, spiritual realms that we cultivate actively. Hell we create when we love selfish, destructive things more than anything else. When we put ourselves and our egotistical motivations above other people, even to the detriment of their life. People to us in a hellish mode, according to Swedenborg, are kind of extensions of ourselves. So if they're not doing everything right for us, or if they're not worshiping us getting in line, essentially an extension of ourselves, then we kind of hate them. And we may hate them tremendously. Doesn't matter how good they are. Doesn't matter what they seem to be trying to do, at least. The only thing that really matters to a hellish orientation is self. And with that, I want to take a moment and turn to our Chatsy, because I know there's always beautiful conversation happening here. I have a few more points to make, but I want to uplift just the community here. I'm glad you all are connecting, hearing each other, sharing where you are. Someone asked, where is everyone? Where's everyone else residing? Hopefully not in hell. Well, you never know. Somewhat in relation to hell, maybe. I know personally, I always am in dialogue with these realms. Swedenborg said we all are, although we tend to gravitate to a heavenly or a hellish realm, even in this life. What's interesting about that is, with Swedenborg's conception of hell, you may ask yourself, why should I be afraid of it? Let's say it exists. We haven't even really gotten to, like, is hell actually real? How could you prove that type of conversation? But let's say it exists. Okay, well, if hell is what I love, and I'm really about it, like, why would I want to change? And in a way, you don't have to do anything, and I can only suggest that you may want to change because of the relative difference, let's say. Because this universe is actually built speaking towards the importance of community, of connection, as the people in Chatsy are, as you are if you're listening to us, or if you're on YouTube, are in connection with us very deeply, I would say. Because when we approach these deeper topics, when we look at our hearts, I think we are in a connection that we don't often get in our everyday interacting. And for Swedenborg, that connection is really real. Like a quantum connection. It doesn't matter how physically far apart you are. There's a vibrational thing, a spiritual thing happening that transcends space and time. And I find that really beautiful and actually quite digestible. And in hell, we do hurt each other to some degree in that realm. They are somewhat vulnerable to each other, living in a shared space with someone else who's hellish, of like-heartedness or like-mindedness, especially when they decide to act on those impulses. And in the next world, in the spiritual realm, or the underlying reality, as Swedenborg would say, we don't exactly have all the limitations to our behavior as we do in this one. For example, I would be less concerned about how you're hearing me right now, my reputation, perhaps, things like that, my bodily safety. And so there's a level of freedom of expression in the next life that actually makes it more heavenly and more hellish in a lot of ways. Someone who may seem very sane and approachable, charming in this world could be a psychopath deep down. And their impulses will find almost full expression in the next life because they no longer care about going to prison or their reputation in Swedenborg's spiritual cosmology. And I find that really, really interesting. And it begs a question of each of us as we discern our own hearts for their hellish orientations or their heavenly ones, hopefully cultivating the heavenly ones with the strength from the higher power. Begs the question, what would we be doing right now or in another situation if no one cared? And would that really be acceptable? In a way, that's an easy way to kind of sift through some of the bigger things in our motivations and discern whether or not they're heavenly or hellish in this real way. And, I think the other thing that's torturous of hell is that they can't do everything that they want all the time, because there is this kind of reaction by their neighbors. There's a vulnerability spiritually that comes when we act out on our destructive, hurtful impulses, partly because we may anger those around us, also because we turn and kind of try to pull further away from divinity, although God is always right there, hoping that we turn back around more in orientation to her. So that's what I have to say right now about heaven and hell. We actually shared a message today that I wrote called Is Hell Real on our worship page, a multimedia service. Read more about it there. In the meantime, this is also a prayer service. So let us take a few moments to take some deep breaths. Allowing the hurriedness of perhaps this shortened podcast or our lives, the deadline around the corner, to dissipate as much as possible. Acknowledging the source of our breath, our life, and vulnerability. And let us turn inwardly in a prayerful stance as I also turn to our chatsi for our prayer requests and play some beautiful music. Well, that was some beautiful music by Paul Deming, who is out of the St. Louis Swedenborgian Church. He's a wonderful musician and a beautiful spirit. If you're in the area, I invite you to visit him and their beautiful congregation. They're amazing people. It was actually the first church in my Swedenborgian journey. I want to end not only in a prayerful mindset, thanking Paul, thanking you all for uplifting your prayers, your meditations, your reflections, but also for thanking Divinity for allowing us to have the freedom to believe what really suits us and to have this journey of discernment. That being said, how do we know hell is real? Well, we do know we can create a hell for each other, don't we? We know that we can make things really hard on each other when we're not affirming, when we're hard, abusive, untrustworthy, all the negative adjectives you can probably think of. They create what we each would consider a real hell, one that we can feel manifestly in our day-to-day. Depending on what's happening, we may feel like it's inescapable. And I want you to know that you are deeply loved and cared for even in those circumstances. I believe that there is a divinity hoping to transform your spirit and your reception of even the most hurtful things. And I know it's easier said than done. And so that's why it also calls on us to have to uplift each other where we can. It calls on us to reduce our hellish impact and our hellish world where we can. Acknowledging that heaven is always growing, and so there's always room to grow. There's always room for self-reflection, for non-defensiveness, for being easier and more divinely merciful towards each other. And that there is a higher divinity, Christ, Sophia, the Lord, hoping to gift us with those blessings, the blessing of divinity, the joy of divinity, the beauty of servanthood and love. So go forth, reducing the hell around you to the extent that's possible, and uplifting heaven wherever you can, knowing that you are loved.